You have a presentation, or is it more?
I yeah, I do have some information to share, and so I'm happy to do that. I'm also happy just to talk. So I think whatever you folks would prefer and also wanna learn about. So I did put together some of our preliminary research that we did this year focused on neonicotinoids. So I'm happy to show you the first year of results and talk about some other challenges that we're observing. So do you want me to start with the work we did this summer, or are there specific questions I guess people have?
Yeah, I think that if you have information you want to start by sharing with us, that would be a good way to structure.
Okay.
And if you have, if you can also send the presentation to Sidonia, I think you
Yep.
have her email address, then she can post it so that we have access to it on our
Yes.
devices and that the public can also access it.
Yep. So I'll start by saying the research that I'll be showing was conducted this summer. We don't have enough research yet to publish it, which for many researchers, we don't like to make our data public until we have more than 1 year of research because, we try to conduct as many years as possible to really understand, whatever it is we're evaluating or questions we're trying to answer. Usually, most always 1 year of research is not enough, but because this is a topic of high interest at this time, and part of the reason that we're doing the research is to help to answer some of the questions and understand options moving forward. I do feel that it's important to share the information as we're collecting it and processing it. But I do think it's really important to keep in mind that this was, research conducted in only 2023. And there were a lot of challenges around that year, and every year is really different. And hence, especially when you're dealing with pests, results can vary greatly. So just hopefully people keep that in mind. Okay,
Thank you.
so
Can I just ask,
yeah,
Heather, are you intending, it sounds like you are, but can you
yes,
just confirm you're intending to continue research
yes,
going
sir.
forward?
Yep. I probably should introduce myself too. I apologize for that. I'm Heather Darby. I'm an agronomist and soil specialist at the University of Vermont Extension. And this is actually my 21st year, which is hard to believe. So I have been working in this area for 21 years. And I also own a farm in Vermont. Obviously, I live in Vermont in Elberg, a family farm that my husband and I operate. So also currently actively farming too. So bring those experiences as well. So we conducted several experiments this year, and also worked to do a lot of education in the agricultural sector. So I think I testified maybe to you last year, and one of the things I talked about a lot was education. We just heard about that from the prior person as well, that we need to do a lot of education with the agricultural community on this topic. We haven't, and clearly we need to. And we've started to do a lot of that in the last year through field days, a whole webinar series that we just kind of wrapped up, speaking at different, winter meetings, et cetera, really trying to talk with farmers about these pests, pest management and risks, and managing risks associated with using these pesticides. Okay, so we did want to conduct some research, I'll say that research focused on some of these pests that are controlled with neonicotinoids. There's a pretty significant lack of research, to be honest, since the 90s. And if you go into the literature and you start digging around for information, the last real kind of current research on the pest was done prior to, really the broad scale use of seed treatments. So we are really lacking in that area, and that's not just here, it's across the entire country. And a lot has changed in Vermont, but everywhere else too, and how we grow crops and the practices that we use, etc. And so we really do need current research in this area. So we're starting, I'm partnering and collaborating with Cornell, as well as obviously they're, into, and so we're trying to work, collaboratively so that we can do as much as we can as quickly as possible. So
Heather, I'm gonna interrupt again just to ask if you can tell us anything about what research might have been done and made available to farmers and maybe others, the general public, when treated seeds were first introduced in the 90s. I understand that's when it was.
Yeah, so the seed treatments were introduced in the 90s, broader scale use of seed treatments, at least in Vermont, was into the, early 2000s. When I started my job in 2000, looking around here, I used to looking for my diploma. I know, that's funny, right? 2003, I said 20 years. So 2003, when I started my job here, there were a few people using seed treatments. It wasn't until, I want to say, possibly 4 years later, so probably around 2006, 2007, that's when seed treatment, insecticide treatment, so neonicotinoid treatment on seed went from being optional, right? So farmers could say, yeah, I will take seed with neonicotinoid insecticide on it, basically that they would choose that, to the seed just coming that way. And I remember that change pretty well because I was at a seed dealer meeting in the fall of that year, and I had first heard about these seed treatments at the same meeting, over the last few years. And it was at that meeting where whoever was speaking from the company just stood up and said, this is no longer an option. All of your seed now will come treated with, one of two rates of insecticide. And I remember it really vividly because I remember asking the question, why are you taking this choice away from the farmers? Isn't it up to them? And I never got asked to go back. So if that says anything about, the situation at the time. So that's the way things have been for the past, 15, I would say 16 years.
It does. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it does, I guess, raise a question of possibly whether you not being invited back was purely a coincidence and there was
Probably.
a legitimate
Probably.
whether there was so little demand at that point for untreated seeds that.
Yeah, I mean, it costs more, so people had to pay for that extra. So it was, I remember some people, were using them and for good reason. And we can talk about that. It wasn't just people were using them. A lot of people were using planter box insecticides at that time So they were, already using insecticides, dumping it into their planters. There were little boxes on the planter. And so the insecticide would be, planted along with the seed. So a lot of people were doing that. And so, in many ways, for those individuals made a lot of sense. They didn't have to mess around with the insecticide, which, was a risk to them. And just, another thing to kind of deal with and manage. And, with the insecticide on the seed, it certainly made things a lot easier. And the rates on the seed are very low. And so, there was some excitement around that for sure, but it did cost money. So people did make decisions based on, the price of the seed, price of the insecticide, whether they needed it or felt like they needed it or not. So, at the time there was a choice, and that ended. So fast forward 15, 16 years later, in Vermont anyway, other states have been using them longer. We've been using them years now. So, certain generations don't really remember the issues that existed prior to that, although they still exist, and I'll show you some examples of it. And even people like me, I have experienced losses to the pests these neonics control. I've seen it. I visited the farms. There was one this year. But it's, again, we've been controlling them with these seed treatments for a long time. So we did set out to, again, it really started with education. And that was, our whole goal was really to educate ourselves, dig back into the literature, start monitoring the pest. I think some people believe it's not real. These pests are very real, and they can cause very real damage as well. But, trying to understand the pest better, when the flights are, how they're impacting seed. And again, this is going to vary every single year, depending on when the corn's planted, what the temperatures are and the growing degree days all around the time of planting crops, not just corn, soybeans. As a vegetable farmer, any vegetable farmer, I'm sure, can tell you they've lost crops of radishes, carrots, to this pest. I mean, I lose crops of radishes regularly to seed corn maggot, entire crops. So, it is a real thing. People aren't making it up. Okay, so we set out to do a replicated trial where we were using treated and untreated seed. And when I say treated and untreated, it's with the neonicotinoids. Okay, so it was either treated with it or it wasn't. Same variety. And then we looked at that over 5 different planting dates. We actually had 6, but we had weather issues, as everybody knows about. So we had to throw out the 6 planting. We had an issue with the planter getting gummed up with soil. It was kind of a mess. So we have 5 planting dates. And again, the reason we're looking at all these planting dates is because this insect pest has a cycle. And, it's really based on at least the first kind of flight of this seed corn maggot fly occurs really after a certain accumulation of growing degree days. So depending on when that happens is when we'll see that first flight of the fly that then lays eggs, that in the ground. And that's what causes the damage, are the actual maggots that emerge from the eggs. So, we're trying to get a handle on, when these flights are occurring. But again, it's based on heat units, and heat units accumulated differ every year. And it's even more erratic now. So that's the other thing we're kind of dealing with, is climate change, right? And I think everybody remembers this year that it was really, really cold in May, and we had that, killing frost like the 21st of May. So, these maggot flights were likely late, maybe for a normal year. And I think we picked that up in our data. So part of what we have to do is kind of understand when all this is happening. So we put out this trial with the different planting dates, and the treated and the untreated corn seed, really, again, trying to learn when these flights are happening, what kind of damage is happening to the seed, how bad it is, kind of how big the flight is, the population versus how much damage, all those things. So in this site, we were looking at soil, neonics in the soil as well, and then looking at crop measurements. So how did it impact yield and stands over these different planting dates? So when we looked at plant stands, and then we looked at the status of that, whether it was statistically different between the treated and the untreated plots, we didn't see any statistical difference at the 0.10 level, which means we have like 90% confidence in the data. And so given that, and you can see the data here, the untreated seed populations, these are corn populations, were sometimes a little higher. Sometimes the treated seed was a little higher, but there was no difference that we could detect in the data that we collected. So we didn't see any population differences that seemed to be statistical.
Heather, what are you measuring there on the left
Yep. So on the
axis?
left are the number of plants. It's reported in acres. And so we put a given number of seed in the ground. We knew how many seeds we planted in every plot. And then when the plants came up, we went out and counted the number of plants that emerged. So we knew exactly how many seed we had put in the ground versus what came up. And then we tried to dig up areas, like if we saw a missing plant or knew there should be more seed, right, more plants there, we went and tried to dig up and find the seed. So we were assessing the stands pretty early. We didn't want the seed to rot or be eaten by something else. And that wasn't overly successful. We did get some of the seed dug up, and we didn't find any insect damage from seed that hadn't germinated. But I'll talk about this afterwards. We need to make some improvements here, but that's what we were looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So then we looked at yields at the end of the season of the treated and the untreated seed, so corn silage harvested at the end of the season. And so you can see for each planting date, again, sometimes untreated plots were a little bit higher. Sometimes the treated plot was a tiny bit higher, but overall they were pretty similar, except for the last planting date here. You can see that, let's see if, no, that it looked different. Like there was a bigger difference than we saw with the other planting dates. This was about a 4-ton yield difference, where, here we're talking maybe a half a ton or a ton, but there were 4 tons difference here. But we still didn't pick up a statistical difference, right? So when we ran all the numbers through our statistical program, they weren't statistically different, but we did see that 4-ton yield decline in that planting date. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. So we did monitor corn seed maggot flies next to the trial, and we actually did this at a few sites around Vermont. We had another site where we were monitoring the flies in Franklin and then one in Addison as well. And so the red bars represent Alberg, which is where the research trial was at. And you can see it looks like we had a peak flight around the 5th of May. And that's before we planted corn, about 5 days before we planted, I think, the first planting date, right? So there were quite a few flies out buzzing around, but we didn't really see much difference. Again, we didn't appear to be losing any population. We didn't see any maggots on the corn seed. So even though there seemed to be a peak flight, it wasn't impacting the corn, or definitely didn't seem to be. And then you can see over to the right around the 8th of June at the Alberg site, we saw another flight, another high population of the seed corn maggot, which, there are multiple flights throughout the year. We generally think about the first flights as being those that would impact corn because it would, or soybeans, because it would occur during planting time. Usually the other flights are, potentially outside window. You can also see that we saw quite high populations at our Franklin site into June. You can see the Addison County site had lower populations of the seed corn maggot flies, but we also stopped monitoring those in June. And that's one of the things that we learned, is that we need to get the traps out that were used to trap these flies in April, and then probably follow them through most of the season. It was a rookie mistake, just learning myself, and also trying to get out to all these sites, because you're picking these up every week. And so it's a lot of work. And then you don't just get maggots on these traps, as these things are, full of everything you can think of. So it takes a lot of time to filter through all of the traps and identify these flies. And honestly, when you see them all, it's like, there's a fly, there's another fly. You got to get them under a scope, to really see the difference in the maggots. So we are seeing peak flights. The interesting thing is that, this peak flight occurred around that 5th planting date. And that's something I'm trying to dig into more, because we did see that decline. And I'm not sure if it was related to the maggots or why that occurred. All right, so we did go out on farms as well. We actually had 5 on-farm sites where we planted treated and untreated corn seed. And we have a lot of farmers obviously really interested in this topic, and very willing to host the research. We went out and counted plant populations like we did at the Alberg research site. This just shows 4 of the sites. The other sites were in Addison County, and I haven't processed all that data yet. But you can see at the Enosburg site, the treated corn had a slightly higher population than the untreated. At the Franklin site, we had horrible populations. These numbers should be in the, really the 30,000 plants per acre range. So this isn't even acceptable. You can see the treated and untreated populations were horrible. East Franklin and Fairfax sites, there wasn't a whole lot of difference between the treated and untreated. And again, we did try to find seed and dig up seed where we could tell there was like a skip. But, we didn't come across any corn seeds impacted by maggots. The issue here at the Franklin site was this was a no-till site. and it was no-tilled into sod after first cut. And although it's hard to remember this, we were actually very, very, very dry in May and most of June. And so this, terrible population was related to not enough moisture in the stand to get the seed up and out of the ground. And then at the Enosburg site where we saw these differences, they had horrible bird damage. So it didn't appear to have anything to do with insect damage.
Representative O'Brien, question.
Heather, what were on the treated seeds? I mean, you're investigating neonics, but did they have fungicides stacked on them?
It also had fungicides, yep.
But no, you didn't do any experiments with diamides?
Not this year, no.
Okay.
But we will be this coming year.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so
We got another question here, Representative Templeman.
Professor Darby, I'm curious to know about the residual impacts since this is a neonicotinoids or bioaccumulative and persist in the soil. Are any of the results you're getting here perhaps from the fact that there are neonicotinoids residually in the soil in the untreated seed experiments?
Yep, could be. Yep, and I'll show you some information coming up. Probably not. I mean, at the Franklin site, this had been in sod for I want to say maybe 10 years, so it's unlikely. But we weren't measuring neonics in the soil at these sites. Same with the Fairfax site. All the sites except for the Fairfax site were no-till. I'll also note that. Okay, so I'm still curious what was happening here at the 5th planting date, why the yields were so much lower. And again, these are excellent yields. So it's like, I'm not sure if anybody's going to complain about 34 tons versus 36, but, or 33, whatever it was. But nonetheless, it was quite a substantial decline. And we're trying to dig into that more. We did see this increase in the seed corn maggot population at that same time, but again, when we dug up some of the seed, we didn't see any maggots. But, I guess we need to reconsider how we're evaluating if they're in the soil or not. You can also see to the right here, here's a distribution of the data. And so you can see the treated seed to the left has much less variation. So there's more consistent yields across the plots. Versus the untreated seed, there was way more variation, which would also, influence whether or not we could pick up a statistical difference. So now I need to really go back and look at each individual plot and try to understand, what's going on there. Why is there that much variation in the untreated corn plots? Like something's going on there. These numbers should be much tighter than that. They shouldn't span that range. Not in like really small research plots. I could see this, on a field scale. So there's something going on there. And again, this is, what we need to look further into. Okay, so we didn't see a lot of difference in the stands at that 5th planting date. That wasn't a huge difference. But again, if you look at the distribution of the population, the distribution again has a huge range in that untreated plot, which means, the data was all over the board. So again, we need to go back and dig into this and see if this was, could it have been related to insect issues or something else. But this was the one data point that we really were questioning, this 5th planting date.
Heather, I'm sorry to interrupt again.
No.
I'm not quite understanding the distribution concern that you've got. So the large variation in the right hand,
Yeah,
which is the untreated.
yeah.
Are we seeing, I'm not seeing how you got, where we get that from something else happening with the untreated.
Yeah, so the plot, so there's a lot of replicates, within this data set.
Mhm.
And you wouldn't think in such a small area that, yields would differ or populations would differ that much, unless there was something really different about the area that it was growing in. So, is it possible that there was, one plot in all of the fifth planting date that had some negative impact from insect pests or something else, right? Could have been maybe fertility. It could be the drainage of that plot, so we just have to go back and look like, why is this so variable? And, a lot of times when you see high variation in data, there's something that we're picking up somewhere, right? There's something creating that variation that we have to understand. The
So
data
the-
should be, should be tighter.
Right, I think I understand that, and I think what I was missing was that there are, in the left-hand graph here, you're showing by planting date.
Right.
Just looking at the orange bars, there's not a great deal of variability there, but you're looking deeper into the data at smaller sets of.
Right. So
Right.
this is the average of
Yes,
all
okay.
plots, of all the untreated plots. And then when you average them all together, we don't see any difference. But when you're looking at the individual data, you see this huge range of where the populations were, or where, in this case, where the yields were. So it kind of matches up in a way, right? So the yields are all over the board. We have some that are low. We also had some populations that were low. And those, maybe those two things are related, and we got to go back and dig into it more. It's surprising to have a 4 or 3.8, ton yield difference and not know why. Like, a half a ton, but when you have greater impacts, you need to dig into it more. So, one of the things we did was, as I said, we counted populations. We tried to dig up seed that we knew hadn't germinated, right? Because we knew we put out 39 seeds per row, in every row. So if we went out and counted and only got 30, where were the other 9 seeds? So we tried to dig those up, which was just, it was hard to do. And we had to assess the plants pretty early so that we could try to capture maggot damage. But, what I have since learned is that plants are susceptible to maggot damage until they're putting out full, true leaves, which is not when we looked and evaluated the plants. So we actually evaluated them as soon as they were emerging, and we probably should have waited until later in their development stage. So again, that's something we need to change this year so we can get a better sense of any potential damage on the plants. We also really need to almost have 2 trials. We have to be able to dig up some of these plants and look for damage on the seedlings, which we didn't do either. So we have, more work to do here to, tune in our methodology. Okay, so people were asking about the soil. So we did go out and measure the neonicotinoids in the soil before planting. And we looked at those. This is at the Alberg site. We looked at neonics in the top 2.5 inches. And then we also looked at neonics from, 2.6 to 6 inches. So we kind of took a sample and separated it into these 2 depths. And so you can see before planting, we didn't detect any neonics in the surface. And then we did, though, detect neonics in the 2.5 to 6 inch depth. And this field had not had a history of neonic seed treatment use, which is why we chose it. But again, after finishing up the trial and thinking more about why we were detecting neonics in this field, we have been studying or using this field for trials. We have been using the same equipment in the trials. There's certainly a chance for contamination. And then we've also planted summer annuals here. And there are certain varieties that we've received that had seed treatment on them. So it's certainly possible that there could be neonics in the field, but I, again, went into it thinking that we hadn't had a history of corn there. So it was a good spot to put this trial. So next year, we're moving it to a different place on the farm that hasn't had any research, any of our equipment, and hopefully we won't detect, but I don't know that because the farm and the surrounding area does have, a history of using neonicotinoids. Okay, so we then measured neonics in the soil 41 days after planting. And so why 41 days after planting? This was roughly the time at which we were going out to top dress the corn. So we were out there taking soil samples to look at nitrate levels. And so at the same time, we took samples also to look at clethianidin levels in the soil. And this time we only took one sample or submitted one sample that represented 0 to 6 inches in depth. So you can see 41 days after planting, we did detect in 100% of the samples neonics, and at 11.3 parts per billion. That was the average concentration for the samples. So in the plots where we were using treated seed, we were detecting neonics 41 days after planting. Okay, so that's that particular study. Obviously we learned a lot. We have a lot of adjustments to make, and we will be, somebody asked about us evaluating other treatments. We are working with Cornell to look at other classes of pesticides, including diamides. And we also want to look at spinosades, which is another class of pesticides that's also used in organic production too. So we want to look at 3 different classes, and again, the untreated component as well. So we will be doing that this year. We will be monitoring out at the farm sites, again, getting the traps out earlier. We are going to measure the soil. We did take measurements at the end of the year. We haven't gotten the data back yet. So really trying to monitor what's happening with the neonics in the soil. And like I said, we have some improvements that we need to make. So that's the first trial that we did. Now the second project was really to look at neonicotinoids in the soil, and also in surface runoff and tile. So this site is in St. Albans Bay. It's on heavy clay soil. It's on a commercial farm. This is a project that has been funded through the Lake Champlain Basin Program and the Vermont Agency of Agriculture. The goal of this study is really to look at the impact of conservation practices on water quality in tiled and untiled fields. And that's the study site that you see here. There's 4 what we call micro watersheds. 2 of those micro watersheds are not tiled, and we catch surface runoff. So they have edge of field monitoring setups where we are able to collect water coming off the field. And then 2 of those micro watersheds are tiled. And they were tiled just prior to the project starting. Each one of these micro watersheds is between 4 and 7 acres. So they're, big areas. And one of the tile and one of the not tiled micro watersheds has all the conservation practices that we've been promoting. And then the other 2 have conservation practices. So trying to really understand, cover cropping, manure injection, no-till, rolling and crimping of cover crops, etc., and how that impacts water quality and crop productivity. So we have taken on also sampling the areas for neonicotinoids. And again, that's being funded through the Agency of Ag, through the AIB, and through the Basin Program. And I guess I just said all this. So we just started sampling this year for neonics, and I can show you again the preliminary data, but we haven't had a ton of time to kind of sort through everything. So please, it is preliminary at this point.
We got another question here, Heather.
Hi, Heather, my mind is exploding with all the variables you have to deal with here.
Yeah.
Quickly back to the corn maggot and wireworms. Are they pretty much pervasive, and no matter where you would plant, or is that also a variable? Like you were saying, they destroyed your fields of radishes. So I just wondered if.
Yep, they have lots of hosts. This isn't just a problem of corn. It's a problem of legume crops. It's vegetable crops. The maggots themselves aren't after crops. I'm sure you've heard this. They're after. They're attracted to decaying organic matter, and so. In systems that have lots of decaying, fresh organic matter, they are more attracted to those sites. And I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. But, that's why, a lot of Vermont agriculture is super conducive and attractive to these kind of pests like maggots. Maggots are after dead, decaying things. Everybody, that's what they do. And so when you have a system like ours, where we have now a lot of cover crops, a lot of organic matter going into the soils. We have manure, which is also going into the ground. And we have sod crops as well. All of that makes our systems conducive to maggots and this pest. So it's not about the fact that it's corn or it's soybean or it's radish. They're not really after that. They're after all that organic matter. But then, by chance, of course, when we have that kind of system and you get a high, infestation of maggots, then those maggots go to those yummy big seeds. The damage I see in radishes isn't them eating the seed, it's them burrowing into the radish. So you know, they're out there, they have a lot of hosts, and they can definitely do a lot of damage when you have a very conducive situation. And again, that's why when you hear from older entomologists and agronomists that, you know, they're very passionate about these pests, it's because they were, you know, here at a time when they cause a lot of issues for people. But again, 20 some odd years using this insecticide, a lot of other people haven't, you know, necessarily experienced that, especially on very large acreages. A lot of the people we also hear from, including myself, I have a lot of colleagues in the Midwest and in grain systems where, you know, they talk about these pests being, you know, very secondary pests, which is true in systems that are predominantly no-till with no organic matter, you know, with only synthetic fertilizers. So they're not conducive situations. So, you know, we have to think about close to home and how we farm here and what we have here to really understand how to best manage this pest right now.
And I think that's the value of we understand that's the value of the research you've been doing. Representative Supernet has a question too.
Hi, Heather. Thank you so much. This is so helpful. When we talk about having those really conducive environments to this pest, have you found any presence of beneficial insects that would be able to help at least mitigate or kind of counteract some of that?
Yeah, so we have some other studies that are looking at beneficial insects and the role that they play in combating certain pests, such as ground beetles, and ground beetles eating slugs, as an example. And we do know that neonics do harm or can harm, you know, the ground beetle population. So we know that that is a trade-off. And we have high slug populations in Vermont because of weather. And we have more slugs now that we have more no-till. So I will say there hasn't been hardly any research done on that, though. And we need to do more. You know, the unfortunate thing that I'm seeing right now in western parts of the country is that they are also spraying insecticides and using it on the seed, because there's an uptick in pests on cover crops that then carry over to the cash crops. And so we have a lot to do here, but yes, absolutely. I don't want to go the other direction. I want to go, you know, I want us to understand how the systems we have today can create those beneficial populations that you're talking about, and can they actually control the maggot populations? Because how we farm today is really different than what we did 20 years ago when these came on the scene.
Representative Templeman has a question too.
Professor, so I'm still kind of stuck on the persistence of the neonicotinoids, and wondering if you've seen any studies where neonicotinoids are being found in biosolids.
I have not. That doesn't mean they don't exist. I have not. I haven't investigated that. I haven't looked in the literature for that specifically.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so here we're looking at neonics in the water and in the soil again. And this is, like I said, it's a commercial farm site. It was in alfalfa and grass before it became a research site for us. And we terminated the alfalfa grass to install the tile. And then from that point on, this field has been in corn, treated corn. Okay, so it's had corn treatment for 3 years. So it's the third year of corn silage with a cover crop. This is a very poorly drained site, heavy clay, and the seed for those 3 years has been treated with neonicotinoids, and we are continuing. We haven't used untreated seed at this site. So before we planted this year, we went out and measured the neonicotinoids at the site, in the soil. So that's the pre-plant numbers. So we picked up neonicotinoids at 3.95 parts per billion in 87.5% of the samples. So not every sample, but most of them in the top 0 to 2.5 inches. And then in the 2.5 to 6 inch, we picked up neonics 43% of the time at a detectable level, and the level was a bit higher. Okay, so the detectable level for us at the state lab is 2 micrograms per kilogram, or 2 parts per billion. So we went out again and did the sampling at the end of the year, right? So this was in November, very end of November, so 187 days after planting, and sampled again, and you can see, the levels had gone up to 5 billion. I haven't ran any statistics on this. I haven't done any of that. These are just the average numbers, and then you can see the amount detectable in 2.5 to 6 inches went up to 75% of the samples with detectable levels, and that average concentration being 4.45 parts per billion. So it looked like it had gone up, in the surface, which makes sense. And the detectable level, lower, a little bit lower in the ground, was very similar to what it was, at the beginning of the season. So that was the data in the soil from this site. We'll continue to take samples, over the years now at different times throughout the season. We did take samples at the 0 to 6 inch depth at 37 days after planting and 120 days after planting, picking up neonics in the majority of the samples that we took. And, average concentrations were 3.72, and then they appeared to go up a little bit. But again, it's hard to say if there were statistical differences. We have not looked at that at this point. So these are just the average concentrations across all the samples, across all of those micro watersheds and all the different treatments that are out there. Okay, so what about in the tile and surface water? So these are concentrations found in the samples that we collected. This is not loading, it's just the concentration in the sample. We'll look at loading in a minute. So these are not all the samples we took. These were, levels that were detectable in the samples that were taken. So again, this site has an auto sampler that basically samples water coming from surface runoff. So you have to have a runoff event. So, a lot of rain followed by water that's running off the field to be able to get a sample. So if there's no rain, or we get a little bit of rain and we don't get any runoff, then we don't get any sample. And same, through the tile, we can only collect water when there's water running out of the tiles. So these sample dates were times where we were collecting, that we were observing or measuring clethiodin, the neonicotinoid, in the tile and in the surface water. So you can see, our first sample where we got both tile and surface was the 16th of June, which makes sense. We didn't really have much rain at all up until the middle of June. And then, all heck broke loose and we had excessive rainfall, across the state. So the highest level of clethodim was that we recorded was on the 3rd of July, following again a big rainstorm event, and then the levels dropped down, but we did have some detectable levels in October. So you can see that in general, the surface, what was coming off the surface in the surface water was greater in concentration than what was coming out of the tile water. And again, these are just concentrations. So let's look at the loads. So the tile, what's coming out of the tile is in blue, and what's coming off the surface is in red. These are the data points. So you can see that there were many points that were below the detectable level that we had taken. And then we had the highest recordings coming off the surface, in the surface water. And again, what was coming out of the tile was low. So these are based on loading, right? So how much water was actually moving at that time. So these levels are in milligrams per, so milligrams of clethodim per hectare of ground. So again, this is loading, looking at loading versus just the concentration in the sample. So again, we had record rainfall in 2023. The levels that we were seeing were higher from the surface runoff, but we only detected clethodim 47% of the time. So we had a lot of samples where there were we were below the detectable level. Okay, that doesn't mean it wasn't there, it was just below the detectable level almost half the time. So I think for the surface runoff, we had 19 points, and only 47% of those had detectable levels of clethodim. And with the tile, we had less detection. We got 21 samples from the tile across the season, and 43% of those 21 had detectable levels of clethodim. The levels were much lower coming out of the tile. You can see the highest level we had for loading was below 2 milligrams per hectare, and many of the points were at 0 coming out of the tile.
Okay, we have another question here.
Yep.
Yeah, Heather, I just want to clarify. We've heard a little bit in previous testimony about the difference in reporting limits between the Cornell lab and the state. So these are all that higher.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And honestly, the difficulty with collecting, and measuring in some of the samples is especially obviously the surface. It also includes soil, right? If it's surface runoff, sometimes there's soil also in the sample. So it makes it more difficult to analyze as well. So, but that's, this is the data year one. Again, 47 to 43% of the samples that we were getting. And again, we're only getting samples when there's water coming out of the tile or off the surface. Our goal here first is to increase the infiltration rate into the soil. That's our overall resiliency plan, so that we get less water moving off from the surface. So our treatments that I was talking about before, adding roller and crimped cover crops, no-till, etc., we're hoping is going to reduce surface runoff. But, these samples are showing you all the treatments, all the values that we're seeing here. I haven't had enough time to go through and, break all the pieces out, but, we are observing clethodim at detectable levels, in the surface runoff and through tile at low rates but nonetheless, it is still there. We did have a very wet year. Obviously, everybody knows that. And clearly that would, impact water flow, movement, etc. So we'll see what this year brings. We plan to continue monitoring all winter. We're monitoring continuously throughout the year. So I think that's it for the studies. I did think it was important to note that there are other issues besides seed corn maggot that occur regularly in Vermont. This was from 2023. This was from this May. There were a number of fields. These are hay fields that were decimated from white grubs. It was pretty disgusting. You can see all of them. You could see all of them. You just had to dig in the ground a little bit, and you could see, dozens of white grubs that had killed this stand. And wireworms can do something similar because we have sod and we have a lot of it. We have a lot of grass ground. We have a lot of clover, alfalfa, things like that. These types of pests build up in those systems. And, clearly this field was 100% loss. The farmer wanted to know what to do. They, clearly going back to reseed, the stand was not an option, not with all these grubs. And he wanted to corn. So in this case, the recommendation was to have a high level of seed treatment, because otherwise, nothing would really grow there in that period of time. So, these pests are on a cycle too, but we do see these are common problems in sod. And so when we go from sod to corn, soybeans, or other crops, this is where I've seen, wireworms and grubs, those kind of pests be real issues in the subsequent crop like corn, and also in the sod itself, like you can see here. So, these pests are real, they're here, they impact our crops. And again, we have a conducive system for these kind of pests. It is different than other places. And, that's why we need to have this conversation and more research. So you've heard a lot, I'm sure, from people. There are no rescue treatments, other than replanting. Once you have these pests, in this case, clearly we knew they were there, and this farmer was going to rotate, so we could make a decision before they went in and just planted something else, so that they could be successful. But, the option in this case was to use a seed treatment. And the one we have available is the corn seed treatments, the neonicotinoids. We could have also gone out and, soil applied an insecticide, but, that's a lot more active ingredient being put on the ground too. These pests have been a pest here because we have in the past, and still do, have cold springs and wet. And, things are slow to germinate during that time, and it just exposes the crop and the seed to these kinds of pests, And, one of the recommendations is to wait until the soil is warm enough to get rapid germination of the seed. But that's really unpredictable. I think about this year as an example. The best time we had to plant corn, it was cold, or soybeans and a lot of other crops too. And so people are planting when the soil is dry enough, really. And, waiting until the soil warms up is super risky. People do that, especially in the organic sector. But generally, we're also talking about a lot less acres that need to be planted. And then maggots and these other pests, they're attracted, some of the pests are attracted to the sod, organic matter, root system, lack of tillage. The maggots themselves are attracted to decaying vegetation. And we have a lot of that in our Vermont agricultural systems, whether it's animal manure, green manures, plow down sods. We have that year in and year out. So, we do have a conducive system, which is something we have to manage. So, I have been trying to look for data on tillage, on cover crops. And like I said, this data is from the 90s when we started to see an increase in the interest in cover crops and reducing tillage. And this work was, you can see one author and one location in Ohio. They didn't have manure in their system, but they were looking at cover crops and tillage over, a period of time. And essentially what they found was that when you incorporate these green manures and cover crops, there's a drastic, impact on the seed corn maggot population. So alfalfa was the most attractive, followed by cereal rye, followed by soybean residue, followed by corn residue. And living residue, so turned over, had to be incorporated. Living residue was more attractive to the maggots than dead residue. And then, interestingly, where there was no tillage, there was no enhancement of the seed corn maggot populations. So our move to no-till systems in Vermont is likely, possibly making us maybe less conducive to seed corn maggot. But we don't have any data to support that. And we also still have a lot more of our acres are in tillage. So, there hasn't been a lot of work done in this area. And, our goal again this year is to start evaluating these practices and the impact on maggots. But we haven't done any of it, and neither has anybody else.
I want to do a time check here just because I know that I am standing between the committee and lunch.
Oh my gosh, we are way over time. I am so sorry.
No, please don't apologize. We had a lot of questions. We got started late. I'm wondering if there's more information that
No, that was it. That was the last slide, and I apologize.
Okay, all right. Well, if you can send the presentation along so that we can all look back at it as we need to, and if there are other questions, we'll pass them along. But very helpful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Yeah, and I'm sorry for going over, and I'm happy to come back or answer more questions as needed. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, I don't see any hands up, so we'll stop there, and we'll be in touch.